Here's your icebreaker question to get you started for today. What helps you rest? What helps you to rest? Talk about that with your group, and when you're ready to dive into the scriptures, you can press play on the video. So we're at a point in the book of Hebrews where we are seeing that the Hebrews writer is talking about how Jesus has been communicated to us all the way through the Old Testament. In 2 weeks ago, in our first week on this book, we saw that Jesus is greater than prophets, greater than even what we expected from the Messiah as a king. Greater even than the angels, because Jesus is the Son of God. Jesus is God, the one who created the heavens and the earth. Then what we also see as we go through it is that last week, Jesus was human, is just like one of us, became flesh and blood, so that he would be tempted and be able to relate to everything that we go through and show us that we can, in fact, walk with God as human beings in this world, in this life. Not only that, when he went to the cross, he died as a human being like one of us, conquering death so that we don't have to be afraid of death anymore. Well, now that we've talked about the divinity and the greatness of Jesus and the humanity, the humility, the humbleness of Jesus, now we get to see how Jesus helps us to enter into rest with God. As the Hebrew writer continues, we're going to find that he talks about two different ways in which the people of the Old Testament, the people of Israel, understood the concept of entering rest. The first one, he uses the story of the Israelites being set free from Egypt, brought out into the desert, and then led to the promised land. And when they went into the promised land, they would enter God's rest. It is the land flowing with milk and honey, the place where God wanted them to experience everything that God wanted for them in their life. When they got to the edge, they sent spies in, and they were afraid, and so they would not enter into the promised land. And the Hebrew writer talks about that as entering God's rest. What we also see as we read this passage is that the adults, we know from the story, are told by God, "You will never enter my rest. You will die out here in the wilderness," because they did not trust God and go into the land that God had promised them. And he uses an interesting word to talk about entering God's rest in the promised land. He says that the Israelites were told good news, or our Bible translations say gospel. They had the gospel, the good news preached to them, that God wanted them to enter into God's rest in the promised land, but they did not trust God, they did not believe God, and so they did not enter God's rest. We are told good news of the gospel, and we are told that we can enter rest with God through Jesus. And so we have to decide, will we receive that gift from God and enter into God's rest? Go ahead and read that passage after I've given you this introduction now, and talk about those things. What does it mean to enter God's rest? What did it mean for the Israelites? What does it mean for us today? How could they have entered God's rest? How can we enter God's rest and receive the gift that is offered through the good news of the gospel? Read it and talk about it. When you're ready to continue, press play on the video. There's a second way in which the Hebrew writer talks about entering rest and having rest in our life. And that is a reference to God resting from his work on the seventh day. In 6 days, God created the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day, God rested from work. Then the Hebrew writer talks to us about how we can rest from our work as well. What's interesting as we look at this is that it's talking clearly to people who are already believers. By the way, this is when we find out that the book of Hebrews is not just written to Jewish people, but to Jewish people who have accepted Jesus as the Christ, the Son of the living God. These are Christians now who have a Jewish background. Anyway, the writer of Hebrews is telling them to consider how God rested on the seventh day and rested from his work. And as he talks to these believers who have already accepted Jesus as their Lord and Savior, gone down into the waters of baptism, washing their sins away, they've died to themselves, they've raised up to a new life, they have been forgiven of their sins and given the gift of God's Spirit. These people that he's talking to, he tells them to make every effort to enter into God's rest. Well, how could he be talking about that if we've already entered into God's rest? Well, he's talking about now resting from work. What kind of work? Well, the work that goes along with sin. You see, sin is hard work. When we choose to get angry at people instead of looking at them as human beings made in the image of God, or forgiving them as God tells us to do when they sin against us. When we get angry at people and we hold on to that anger and it turns into bitterness and then rage and malice and comes out in our actions, the one that we hurt the most is ourselves. What we end up doing is getting ulcers and losing sleep. We hurt because we are angry, and we are angry because we are fighting God. We do not enter into his rest, resting from our work. This is true of any sin. As you play it out in your mind, you can start to think about places where you have ignored God, where you have not trusted God, not believed God, or fought God outright. And when we do that, it is hard work. And so the Hebrews writer encourages us as well to enter into his rest, to rest from work, and to enjoy being with God, drawing near to God, and walking with God. Go ahead and read the passage. Talk about that. How can we rest from the hard work of sin? And then pray for one another that we will all enter into his rest and that we will stay in a place of rest from the work of sin. Know that I'm praying for you as well. And I ask you to pray for me that I will stay in a place of rest with the Lord as well. God bless.